Hey everybody, it's Daniel. This is not your regularly scheduled Creature Club, Treasure Trove, Villain Squad, Creature Club Network thing, but it is going to be something interstitial that I'll put together just on myself. Tim is still in America and DC has been busy this week with gigs, which is very cool, but does mean that we are sort of low on the old manpower. So if you're wondering, this is normally a podcast with more than one person, and I'd recommend you listen to those. But for people who like our show and like us to put things out regularly, this is sort of for you. If you are a new listener, please listen to something else. I don't want to tell you how to live your life, but I mean, this should not be your first episode. So this week I'm just going to go over something small. This isn't going to be a very long episode. We're just going to talk a little bit about dungeons. Dungeons are half of the name of the game that we call Dungeons and Dragons, which, by the way, if you're a new listener, sorry, just making sure, that's normally what this podcast is about. It's normally about Dungeons and Dragons. There's a lot of things about dungeons that I certainly didn't think about when I was a more inexperienced DM, and dungeons can be a little bit intimidating to put together, but I think they can be really exciting and really unique, and I think that they are a part of they're part of how we play D&D that can be so different to anything else. I think that when you are out in the wilderness and you run into some orcs or some hobgoblins or some dire wolves and you fight them, and maybe you use a tactical map or maybe you don't, but that's very similar to like a lot of sort of tactical miniatures games that already exist. And I do think that the way that we can get a dungeon to work and the different things we can do with a dungeon as a dungeon master, I think there's some really unique opportunities there. So I'm just going to sort of talk about, I guess, a list. I don't want to call it a list because that sounds kind of juvenile, but I'm going to talk about the different things that I like to put in a dungeon that I think make it interesting for the party. So when I'm designing a dungeon, I like to think about what that dungeon was before it was a dungeon. I've never designed a dungeon in the Dungeon Master's Guide. In the 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide, it talks about like death trap dungeons, which are literally dungeons meant to like capture and kill adventurers, and I do think those are cool. I think there's certainly a place for those. I actually think if you have the right kind of party, or if you lead with the fact that, you know, they're going to be facing off against effectively an unfair trial, then I think that a death trap dungeon could be really exciting. But so far the dungeons I've used have all been ruined buildings, or like abandoned structures. I've often used structures that have kind of sunk into the ground. One of the dungeons I ran way back when was a sunken tower. It was like a sort of a keep that had like over time sunk deep into the ground. I'm not a geologist or a geographer or someone with any sort of qualification. I don't know exactly how things sink into the ground, but I do think it's very evocative. I think there's something really cool about the fact that, you know, when your party enter the dungeon, they're not going in through the door, they're going in through like the top window of the tower, right? I think that's really interesting. You could even have glass there, although it would be weird for it to survive that long. I normally just, you know, make it clear to the party that they're kind of clambering through a window, basically. Something the rogue might be used to, but maybe not the, you know, paladin. Although, you know, who's to judge where they come from? So that's like sort of how I work it. I like to think about like what the building was, what did it do before, and how did it work, and, you know, what does that inform? You know, function follows form follows function. Yeah, form follows function. Oh my goodness. So as a result, you know, what does this building do, and therefore how is it laid out? How does it make sense? And so the example I'm going to use for the purposes of this podcast is a dungeon I'm actually designing at the moment that I might be running my players in. I don't think they listen to the podcast, so we'll hopefully be all right. But if they are, I'll try not to spoil it, I suppose. If you're playing in a game I'm in right now, as of March 2018, maybe skip this episode, or don't. I'm not your dad, I hope. Okay, so let's talk about this dungeon. So first of all, I'll tell you what its function is. The dungeon is called the Tomb of the Golden Aegis. Now, the Golden Aegis was an order of knight in the way back when, but they're gone now because, you know, that's how these things work. So this building is a tomb that sort of inters the members of the order. So it's this old building. It hasn't sunken into the ground, which is unusual for me, but it's really like it is a one floor building. It's got one floor and a basement, and it's a very small dungeon. It's not designed to drag out for more than a short session. It's kind of the group I'm running for at the moment are kind of new to the game, and I kind of want to just give them a small dungeon to give them a feel for how dungeons work. So let's talk about how the dungeon works. From the outside, it's sort of a low stone building. It's got a cracked dome roof, and that's important because in the first room of the dungeon, which is sort of, it's almost like the room where people would come to maybe pay tribute to the knights, or perhaps where like sermons were held, or kind of like rallies were held. So this is sort of it's this stone room, and it's you walk in, and it's, the stone is about this sort of equal with ground level, but then it goes lower than ground level into sort of long stone steps, and those stone steps are kind of inspired by, this might not be how it actually worked, but if you think back to like how movies often depict like Greek and Roman sort of government meetings, like Senate meetings, and how they're all kind of, there's like these sort of low steps and these big columns around them, and that sort of idea, that's almost like it's almost like a lecture hall in a way. But that lower down area, because of the cracks in the roof, has actually filled with rainwater. And so this is kind of, I guess, one thing I would say is try to have different types of terrain in your dungeon. This is, I guess, lesson one. I'll try to enumerate them in an interesting way so you know what I'm actually talking about. It's very easy to draw a dungeon on a map, on a grid map, and just be drawing like, okay, there's a corridor, and then it goes off here, and it goes off here, and then it does this, and then it does this. But one of the most straightforward ways to make something different is just be like, well, you can't get to the other side of the room unless you want to swim. And obviously, in Dungeons and Dragons, if a player says, well, I swim across the water, they normally just do it. There's not normally checks or anything, but even just making it clear to them that, like, the room is broken up, it's made of these different things, and like that idea that the rainwater has collected into this broken down old tomb, and now it's filled this room. I think it does a really good job of kind of, it ages the place, right? Like, because we've all experienced rain, and like rain normally dissipates pretty quickly. So if this rune has been here long enough, that rainwater has filled this part of the room to maybe, I don't know, like waist height at the highest. It's not supposed to be that deep water, but even still, you must think like, well, that's a lot of rain. I wasn't sure based on the size of the area whether or not it should have fish in it. I might come back to that. But what's important is that the room is partially flooded, and there is a bridge, but you can't get to the bridge from where you are. You have to kind of go around through other parts of the dungeon. And importantly, this is lesson 2. I'm sorry if these lessons are poorly spaced. I'm doing my best, but I'm on my own. Lesson 2 is give your players choice. It doesn't always have to be, a meaningful choice, because in this case anyway, I don't want the dungeon to last very long. But when they come into this main room, this main flooded room that we've already discussed, they can go left or right. If they go left, they end up in a small room. The room has got a little bit of treasure in it, and it's got some kind of world building stuff, and there are clues there for the sort of overarching plot to do with different factions in conflict, which obviously is sort of which I want to try and set up as the player's prerogative to find out. Like, they'll have to go into that room and ask questions to learn about this. If they don't, well, that's completely allowed. They do not owe me any sort of, I am paying X amount of attention. We're not playing Sherlock Holmes or Jonathan Creek. We're playing Dungeons and Dragons. That room contains neither a dragon nor another dungeon, so who can blame them? Anyway, and then if you go the other direction, if you go right, instead you end up going through a couple of rooms. I think it's a kitchen, and then the bunks where like some of the monks who used to attend to the graves slept. You go through those 2 rooms, and then there is a wooden bridge in the second room that connects to the next area in the dungeon, and that wooden bridge crosses over the water. Now, as I said, it's only waist high. You don't need to go through the bridge, but the implication is that wooden bridge is a new thing, and it was built by the inhabitants of the dungeon, which is goblins, because goblins are a great enemy that I'm a big fan of. So this dungeon at the moment is currently filled with goblins. Now, those 3 rooms I initially described, I guess 4 technically, but one of them's the boring lore room. We'll put that to one side. But we've got 3 linked rooms that all lead to the next area. So we've got this big main chamber. Let's just call it the main chamber. That's the flooded room. There's a bridge crossing over the flooded area, and the non-flooded part of it is pretty small. It's kind of just big enough to get to the other rooms. And then there's 2 rooms that connect to that, and they're in a corridor. The kitchen, and then after that, the bunks. Now, what I'm going to do in that area is I'm going to set up kind of a prolonged encounter where there are goblins in the main room, and they are on the bridge. They're not next to the players, they're on the bridge. And this is, I guess, maybe a lesson, I don't know. But the goblins in the 3 rooms are not going to wait for the party to come and fight them. They're not going to stand in their room and wait. They're going to rush the party. So the 3 goblins in the room that the party come into, the ones on the bridge over the water, they'll all have bows. And in fact, one of them is going to have a big crossbow mounted onto a piece of wood that they've kind of set up as a barricade. And I'm going to have a fun rule where there's like an arc that the crossbow can fire into, and they can't shoot anywhere else. So if the players are smart and paying attention, they can get out of the way of the crossbow, and then the goblin has to swap to their short bow, or just toss javelins or something like that. And then there are going to be some goblins looting that kitchen I mentioned before, and some goblins looting the bunk room. I'm definitely, by the way, and this is something I recommend because goblins are a silly enemy, definitely going to have one of the goblins rush out of the kitchen with like just a frying pan on their head, or like a saucepan or something. I love the idea of goblins using improvised armor and improvised weapons. I think I would even say that goblin gets like +1 AC because of the helmet. I wouldn't say that to the players, but I would add it in my head. I might have like, there's the goblin with the saucepan helmet, there's the goblin who has like the 2 butcher knives, and they're actually kind of dangerous because they found the only actual weapons. And then I don't know, maybe a goblin with like a bag of flour, and they toss it on the party, and just everyone has to make a con save, or they're distracted for a second because they're all coughing and stuff. That could be fun. Is this a lesson about dungeons? I don't know. I feel like it might be. Make your monsters part of the dungeon. Give them a reason to live there. The goblins live in this old tomb because it's abandoned and it's relatively sheltered from the wind. And, there's an old kitchen and a bunk area. As far as the goblins are concerned, those are incredible creature comforts. There's even this abandoned old crossbow that one of the goblins has set up as on a barricade. They've built this bridge to make it more convenient for them to reach other parts of the dungeon that they might be interested in, or even just that they're interested in, knowing where they can go, and maybe that's how they reach the dungeon. And let's move on, because I feel like I've gotten too distracted. I'm not teaching you enough. So there's now a couple of ways that the party can reach the next part of the dungeon. The obvious way is cross the bridge, and they'll enter into another smaller room, and that small room will have a locked door. Is this a lesson? Locked doors, are they a lesson? Do you need to know about locked doors? You should lock something in your room. This room they're going into, by the way, is going to be sort of study. So it's going to have an old broken down wooden desk that the goblins have hacked apart for wood. It might even have, I think, as well as having the locked door, it'll have a metal strong box. And it's obvious the goblins have been hammering away at this thing, right? But they haven't got into it, and they don't have the finesse to know how to pick the lock. I think stuff like that's really important and useful. I think I feel like dungeons are the perfect chance to let the thief shine. And it's not that the rogue. It's not that I don't think that rogues get to do stuff normally, but I think that there are so many times where you don't get to pick locks in Dungeons and Dragons, depending on the kind of game you play, of course. But I feel like you don't want to lock too many things. You don't want to lock your party out of things. But it's just really cool. Like picking locks, you feel clever, right? Like, you're not just beating things up, you're also outsmarting obstacles, things like that. But anyway, so I guess another lesson is have stuff for the party members you're running for. I don't even think you need to know that. But importantly, and I guess this is probably a better lesson, right? That locked door is not the only way into the next part of the dungeon. So if my party don't have a rogue, or if the rogue doesn't successfully pick the lock, they don't just have to stop, or I don't have to improvise for them. See, that water I mentioned before, there's a stairway at the back of it, down another flight of stairs, a short flight of stairs. It's almost like, it's not a full level, it's only like 3 steps down, and then there's another doorway, but it would be difficult to see unless you were on that wooden bridge. So as they're crossing the bridge, I might mention it to them. Probably will. I definitely will. I want to make sure they know about it. But the idea is that you'd have to obviously go underwater for that one, and hey, most adventurers have a pretty incredible capacity to hold their breath, but nevertheless, they might decide they don't want to get wet, which is very reasonable, and instead try to pick the lock. But if they fail to pick the lock, then they can attempt to go the other way, which in this case actually leads to the same room. So there's kind of an important elevation difference here. It's a little hard to explain when I'm trying to walk you through a dungeon with my voice. I hope I'm doing a good job, by the way. Where the locked door we mentioned before, that leads to a balcony, and that balcony overlooks another room. And if you go through the other passage in the flooded room, by the way, that's going to be blocked by like a kind of damaged metal grated door, kind of like a prison door. But it's not going to be such a problem that the party couldn't knock it down with a couple of strength checks. The only reason I have it there is because I like the idea that they might try to break down the door with the strength check and fail, and then have to tick away rounds of their constitution, that they're running out of breath. I think there's some cool potential for tension there, right? Like where the strong barbarian or even just anyone, even just the ranger or whatever is down there, and they're just like knocking away, desperately going for this door, and you're running out of breath, and you can feel your head getting light, and maybe at the last minute you break for the surface, or maybe someone else pulls you out. Like both of those are great opportunities. Like one of those is an excellent moment of like team building and camaraderie, where like they spent too long under there and they clearly ran out of breath, and like one of their characters like pulls a rope and like hauls them back up to the surface. Like that'd be really cool. Otherwise they break it open, and then it's very rewarding that they did this thing. And obviously once the door is broken open, everybody can swim through like no problem. They just have to take their time doing it. So then this next room, I just spent so long talking about one specific thing. I'm doing a terrible job. I apologize. So my lesson as such is, don't lock out somewhere from your dungeon, but that doesn't mean you don't have to make it check based. Like as I said there, I'm using strength checks and they can fail, but the point is that I want to make their failure tense. So that's the difference between the strength check with the old, I guess I don't want to say prison door, the sort of warped door underwater, and the locked door above ground. The locked door above ground, you need to pick the lock. If you fail, obviously, it's reasonable to say, well, you can't pick this lock, you tried to and you failed. But in the case of the warped door underwater, eventually it will give if you hit it enough times. Common sense will tell you that. So I would allow multiple strength checks, and the only difference is I would make it clear that like you maybe need to build up a bit of momentum. Like I might say you need to pass like 2 strength checks to open the door, and if you go back to the surface to regain your breath, which is a sensible thing, I might say, well, I'm going to reset your count, which is not necessarily in physics how doors work, but it is more tense mechanically, and narratively it's more exciting if they have to stay underwater, because if they don't, then they'll have to do it all over again anyway, so what's the point in coming back up early? But that's very much at your discretion, of course. Anyway, this next room, this is where we start to get into some stuff that I think is really cool and I really like. This next room is partly flooded like the room before, but it's also partly not flooded, which is good because the party are going to be in there. And there is, in this room, there's very little, but there is a statue against one wall. Now, that statue has a riddle. I'm very tempted to spoil it for you, but I'm not going to because, again, my party might be listening. But this is the thing that I want to talk about. I think riddles are super cool. I think riddles are probably one of the coolest things you can do in Dungeons and Dragons. And I think that the dungeon is the best time, almost always the best time, to deploy a riddle. Because the thing is, I think we all know, I think anyone, who sort of thinks about, kind of tries to be security conscious, which I think everybody does it, to some extent. We all kind of realize, sensibly, you should never use a riddle for security. You would not use a riddle to lock the door to your house, right? You would not use a riddle to unlock your computer, even though Windows insists on you having a password hint. But, again, you wouldn't do it. It's just inherently less secure than a passcode that only certain people know, or a key in the case of a doorway, or a form of identification confirmed by another party. Your passport when you're going through passport checking, things like that. None of these, no real life security measure relies on riddles because, as we all know, they're a terrible idea. But they're very cool. They're very, very cool. This depends on the party. I think it's very fair to say. This is a really big case if it depends on the party. I think riddles are amazing. I love riddles. And I think there's something about the unreality of a dungeon that means that when the party encounter a riddle, they are quicker to accept it. Does that make sense? That idea that if your party go up to a door and the bouncer won't let them in unless they answer the riddle, that's weird, right? Why doesn't the bouncer just have a passcode? That's how normal bouncers work in like the movies I've seen. That's how secret societies work. They just want a passcode. They don't give you a riddle. But when your party are in a dungeon, they're already doing something that doesn't really happen in real life. There aren't really very many strong examples to call on. And the examples that exist, like off the top of my head, I think of Indiana Jones. Indiana Jones, of course, in The Last Crusade, there is an excellent riddle. There's a really, really tense scene with a series of riddles. And so for those players who are acquainted with that kind of tradition, riddles have a certain believable quality to them, even if that's just been reinforced by other fiction. They will think, oh yeah, this is kind of part of the fiction of the dungeon, that there are riddles in here. And of course, Lord of the Rings, how did we get into Moria? What's the Elvish word for friend? So I think that you absolutely owe it to yourself to put a riddle in your dungeon. If you don't have a mind for riddles, there's plenty online. I tend to roll my own personally, just because I like it. I like doing it. I tend to come up with the solution and the question at the same time when I do. They sort of just spring on me in a moment of inspiration, and I take them down and, maybe refine them later on. But I do really encourage you to, and this is the second point about riddles. We're still talking about riddles. I'll stop talking about them because the actual lesson is riddles. The second part of that lesson is it should not be a hard riddle. There are really interesting riddles that are very difficult and very challenging and kind of require a great deal of lateral thinking and strangeness. In general, your riddles in Dungeons and Dragons should be pretty easy for a few reasons. Firstly, you will have people in your party who don't, like, this is the people, not the characters. You will have people in your party who who maybe don't, do a lot of riddling, who don't have that sort of mindset or aren't familiar with it, and therefore to them this isn't necessarily very interesting. You'll also have people who maybe aren't sure about, oh, hang on, should my character be solving this riddle or should I be solving this riddle? Now, in my opinion, a riddle is a puzzle for the players, not a puzzle for the characters. That's just a personal thing, because I think it's a lot of fun to let people engage with the puzzle you've given them without feeling like they're cheating or that they should be restraining themselves somehow. They should just sort of be allowed to play along. And I think that's more fun, but that's my choice. And that's my mindset on the matter. And third of all, and I've been a player in these situations, even when you give your players a simple riddle, they will sometimes just completely fail to solve it. There's a couple of reasons for this. It can be because what they are imagining in their head is different to what you are trying to tell them. But it could be any number of things. It could just be that they don't know the riddle or they don't get it. It could be that because you've made your own riddle, it's actually not as clear as you think it is. So yeah, seriously, keep it simple. I'm going to give you an example riddle now. Literally just, this is one I made, and I'm going to read it out to you, and you're going to guess what it is, and you're going to do it because it's incredibly easy. And this is I think exactly, this is like legitimately, and this is not an insult to any players I've ever had or anyone in general, but this is legitimately how I feel, how difficult I feel a riddle should be, because I don't think they should be difficult at all. Okay, so here it is. Tall, strong, pillared I'll doom, grave reminder of a stranger's doom. Did you get it? Yeah, I'm sure you did. The answer, of course, is a tomb. Now, I like that riddle because it's very straightforward, and of course it rhymes, and rhyming is fun, as Dr. Seuss taught us. But yours doesn't have to rhyme. It doesn't have to be language based. It can be physical. It can be based on shapes. It can be based on the layout of a room. It can be based on something interesting like constellations or the position of the solar bodies of your universe. But regardless of what it is, do keep it simple. Okay. So what have we learned so far? You give your players choices. They don't necessarily have to be meaningful. Try to come up with different ways, different terrain types, different sort of movement puzzles, maybe is a nice kind of turn of phrase for it. Different movement puzzles for your party to encounter, like they have to climb up a rock face while goblins throw rocks at them, or kobolds drop rocks on them, and would be kind of fun. Or they have to swim through water and it's full of, I don't know, eels or something like that. Eels would be kind of appropriately dungeony, right? Or, or the floor is made of lava. Absolute classic that we've mentioned obviously in the Creature Club Beholders episode, which I recommend much more than this. But but the idea that the floor has some dangerous quality to it. It doesn't have to be lava. If you're worried about lava killing your players, which you should be, lava is very dangerous. But what might be fun is if the floor was covered in like scorpions or something, right? Which is awful. That's just, that imagery is terrible. But the idea that if you misstep and you fall in the scorpions, they'll sting you and you'll take some damage. You might be poisoned, but you probably won't die instantly, which would happen if you fell in the lava. And of course, the cool thing about stuff like that, about setting a fight with, say, like the floor is made of scorpions, is that obviously it's terrible for the party, but then hey, they fight something and they push the thing they're fighting, like they push the orc into the scorpions, and the scorpions sting the orc as well, and it's like, well, at least we've got this asset we can use in battle. So yeah, think about like movement puzzles and different things you can do. And then of course, we talked about different options. We talked about trying to make sure your players don't get locked out of things. This all seems like stuff that's probably kind of obvious, but I hope it's helping a little bit, even if you're just stealing my ideas, which again, you should absolutely do if you find them useful. And then finally, of course, riddles. Riddles are great. Use riddles, keep them simple. Now, there's another thing in the room. There's a door, and the door actually, well, door is the wrong word. There's a doorway into the next area, and the next area is actually how you progress the dungeon. The statue with the riddle on it is entirely optional. And this brings us to another interesting point. God, it's taken us a long time to get to any point. I'm terribly sorry. But the other point is your dungeon should have treasure in it. This is, I think, very obvious. I think it's something that a lot of people maybe think about and maybe don't think about, but your dungeon should have treasure in it. And I think almost more importantly, every room in your dungeon should have treasure in it. It doesn't have to be a lot of treasure. It doesn't always have to be interesting, and it doesn't always have to be obvious. You can put treasure somewhere where you don't expect anyone to find it, but there should be treasure there. You should, if you have a room where, like, an obvious example is if it's a dungeon and it's set in a keep, and maybe there's a room that's a pantry. Put anything in the pantry. The food is probably rotted away because it's an old pantry. But, I don't know, there's knives there, or there's like one potion, or there's like herbs that the party could sell or use to enhance their cooking. There's salt, take salt with you. Salt's a valuable resource. But, every room in your dungeon should have treasure. And if you're not sure, if that doesn't if you don't know where the treasure should be, if you're kind of like struggling with a room in particular and you can't figure out where the treasure should be, my recommendation would actually be go to the Dungeon Master's Guide or go online, either one, and Google random treasures, basically. Get something, because I think this is what would really help. So there's actually I think it's a 4th edition resource, or it might be 3.5, but it's an online resource anyway, and I think it was built by Wizards of the Coast, and it's effectively a random generator for what you find in a barrel or a crate when you open it. And you obviously don't have to use those things, but that idea that you would use this random generator and it would tell you about like a tapestry embedded with jewels, you might go, oh, okay, that's interesting. Maybe that's the treasure here. Maybe like the treasure isn't like a sack of gold coins under a rock. It's like on the wall there's a tapestry, and anyone with a sharp eye, and this would be a great chance again for that rogue to notice it for free, right? You might say that anyone else in the room, you test their passive perception or you test their active perception. I'd recommend passive personally, but that's my kind of style. I might say that the rogue kind of auto passes, right? Like the rogue's passive perception is almost like naturally attuned towards valuables, right? That feels correct to me. So you might, if the rogue walks into the room, you might say, well, you immediately notice because, you're used to casing places that the tapestry on the wall is probably worth a good bit of money. Whereas maybe anyone else, either you use their passive perception, or they might ask, can I look for treasure? In which case you maybe roll investigation. Yeah, every room in your dungeon should have treasure. It doesn't matter how much or how little, it should have treasure. It doesn't have to be just gold coins. It doesn't even have to be something physical. It can be something like weird, something kind of fun. Like, for example, might be if you listened to our treasure trove episode on the bees of the magic items in the Dungeon Master's Guide. One of the items in there, the first item we covered, was the bag of beans. You could have a bean from the bag of beans, but what I was going to suggest as well is one of the options there is mushrooms. And these mushrooms have a 50% chance of either poisoning you or healing you. And so that might be a really obvious example, right? Like just have a kind of a filthy room and there's mushrooms in the corner. And if someone asks and, maybe makes a survival check, you tell them, yeah, these might be healthy. You might be able to use these to heal yourself. But think about there is more than one kind of treasure. Obviously, like magic items, scrolls, potions, swords, shields, armor, blah, blah, blah. Arrows are actually, special shout out to arrows, which we mentioned in Treasure Trove A, actually, where I talked about how arrows are useful because even if you give your player very powerful arrows, they break after they're used. So your player has to be kind of clever with when they're going to use them and how important they are, which is kind of straightforward. It's very easy to give the ranger, 7 + 1 arrows because they can only use 7 of them and then they're gone forever. But, there's a lot of other kinds, like you could also have unusual magic effects, magic mushrooms on the ground. There was a dungeon I ran in a previous campaign where, well, it was a very small dungeon, but anyway, one of the things it had in it was it had a fountain that made water that could heal the party. That could be interesting depending on what kind of, game you want to run. There's like more intangible things, like if one of your party is maybe like like a lore master or they're studying something specific, you might leave clues for them. That's a great example. Or you might kind of include some sort of like pet. In the case of goblins, it doesn't really make sense. Although it might be interesting if, for example, you fought some goblins and then one of the goblins was actually imprisoned, and then you could like release that goblin and gain a temporary ally for the dungeon. But there's also things like you could find an egg, and maybe you find an egg in the goblin nest, and you're like, well, goblins don't lay eggs, right? And now you have this egg that you have to wait until it hatches to find out what it is, which, of course, as the DM gives you time to figure out what's in it, which is doubly handy. But yeah, there's lots of different kinds of treasure. I mean, there's a reason that, adventurers go into dungeons, right? They don't go in there for fun, or maybe sometimes they do, but they normally go in there to turn a quick profit. So treasure in every room. It doesn't always have to be money, doesn't always have to be valuable, it doesn't always have to be tangible, but there should be treasure in every room. Now, we're almost done. We've entered into the main room. We've dealt with the flooded chamber. We've fought the goblins. We've either picked the lock or kicked down the door underwater. We've entered into sort of the statue room. We may have solved the riddle of the statue, or maybe we didn't. We didn't need to, and that's sort of important as well, that the statue doesn't lead to an essential part of the dungeon, it just leads to an optional part of the dungeon. And then we're going into the next room, and the next room is the final room. And so this, I guess, is our final lesson. First of all, your dungeon needs a boss. I think there are a very small number of cases where you cannot justify your dungeon having a boss, and if you feel like you're not sure you can, I would almost be inclined to say that you can skip the boss and go to the second part of this advice, which is your boss needs an arena. So if you don't want to have a boss, just make the arena and figure out what the monsters are doing there and how they're going to fight the party as a result. Now, in my case, this end of the dungeon, we fought some goblins. We're in the tomb of the Gilded Aegis, which is an old order of knight. They're long gone. These goblins have made their home in it. Now we're going into the crypt. That doorway we walked through goes further underground. It actually goes back around under the building we've been through. So now we're deeper underground. We're in the basement of this old tomb. The first room we entered, that was sort of this meeting area, it had a small number of coffins in it. And for the party, if the party were paying attention, maybe you tell them, maybe you make it clear to them, maybe you don't, but those coffins in the first room, they were only the coffins of the Grand Masters of the Order. But of course the Order had plenty of knights, right? It was this mighty order once, many years ago. Many generations ago even. So this room here, this crypt underground, it holds all of the knights that fell in battle or died of old age, but every knight who served under the Gilded Aegis is laid to rest here. There's a couple of ways you could do this. You could have big stone coffins stacked high. What I was thinking of doing, but I think you can change this depending on your needs, was having it that there are shelves, and each of the shelves has an urn with the cremated remains of the knight, and behind the urn, the shield of that knight. Because of course we call them the Gilded Aegis. If you don't know, Aegis, as far as I know, means shield. I'm not an etymologist, so it's a slight, I think, simplification, but an Aegis, at least from my understanding of Magic the Gathering, is a kind of protective aura or shield. So, of course, these knights who were members of the Gilded Aegis had shields. Maybe not all of them, but let's say for the case of their grave, they were given a shield. These urns maybe have the name of the knight on them. But more importantly, we're not here to talk about these dead knights. Well, we are a little bit, but more importantly, we're talking about this boss. Now, down in this basement, we're going to fight a goblin boss. I'm not going to spoil which kind of goblin boss, but I would recommend, if it's goblins, I'd recommend a hobgoblin boss. I'm using a hobgoblin boss, but I won't say what kind of hobgoblin specifically, because that's kind of a trade secret, that's a campaign secret. But all you need to know is I am using a hobgoblin as the boss of the goblins, because they're excellently poised for that kind of thing. So we're encountering this hobgoblin in this crypt. This is a room with a very specific architecture because it's a crypt. Maybe it doesn't necessarily make sense, but it's certainly dramatic and cool. It's designed more in a way for that than it is to be appropriate for how you'd actually bury people, because nobody really cares about stuff like that. Well, most people don't. If you do, I apologize. I'm not trying to diminish your feelings. I just mean that in the heat of the moment of a boss battle, I think that the party are very willing to overlook, architectural deficiencies. So this is a room, as far as I'm concerned, with shelves and pillars, kind of a mixture of maybe lower things that the party can see over, and then pillars which block line of sight and act as excellent cover. So we've got our hobgoblin boss. They have a couple of lackeys. And now what I'm going to do here, and this is something that I don't know if I would recommend overall, but this is something that I'm doing that I think is a lot of fun. I'm adding a complication to the boss fight. So as you know, we're fighting in the crypt of an old order of knights, and what if those knights didn't like being disturbed? So I already told you that the knights were cremated and that there's a lot of them buried here. And so if their spirits were awoken, you'd get a lot of spirits all at once. So I came up with a monster I thought was appropriate. And the monster is called the Spectre of Ash. And all this really is, it's a spectre from the monster manual with a couple of cool abilities. It like breathes, it basically creates an aura of smoke around it that makes it harder to hit, and also chokes players who are nearby, or chokes any creature that's nearby. It can create like an aura of the smoke. It kind of breathes out this big like fog cloud, smoke cloud that like overwhelms everyone inside it. And this spectre, of course, is just angry and bitter at being disturbed. So it's going for whoever it can. It's going for the party and the goblins in equal measure. This has a pretty cool... There's a lot of really cool stuff you can do with this. This is basically my way of fine-tuning the boss fight as it proceeds. So this is pretty cool because if the party are doing well, if they are easily handling the goblins and the hobgoblin, then the spectre is going to pay more attention to them, and now they've got more problems. But if they start to lose, then the spectre is going to change its attention to the goblins. You know, and I might try to make it so that it seems obvious why the spectre is doing it, like as in, oh, well, the goblins are the ones that are causing the problems, or because you guys are making more noise, or whatever. You know, I try to have reasons that keep the illusion that this is a random creature, but really, it's sort of a way for me to ensure that the boss fight doesn't completely descend into madness, which is sort of a concession I'm making because this is, as I said before, this is a dungeon for newer players. I don't want them getting destroyed, getting wiped out in the first dungeon they encounter, because that would be quite a negative experience, I think. Now, there's one other thing I want to talk about in this dungeon that I didn't mention before, which is my fault entirely. I actually did forget about it. This isn't a clever turnaround. I've actually honestly forgotten about this. Now, we already know there's the goblins up top, there's the boss below. The spectre's going to wake up when the players show up because this fight in the crypt full of dead knights will disturb it and awaken it. Right, we know all this stuff, but we're gonna foreshadow that the spectre is there, and the way we're gonna do that is kind of cool. I have this kind of fun idea that I hope works out, where the knights, the ghosts of the Grand Masters, who are the coffins in the room that was flooded way back at the start of the dungeon, their spirits are still there too, but unlike the Spectre of Ash down below, the spirits of the Grand Masters they're more at peace. They've still retained a lot of their personhood, and so maybe if the party attempt to commune with these Grand Masters, or if they disturb the graves, I think the Grand Masters will confront them, but not necessarily violently, more in sort of a they don't want to be disturbed, but they will bargain with the players. This is something else that I think is sort of a good thing to have in a dungeon. This is the reason I'm bringing it up. These ghosts can be negotiated with, and if the party play their cards right, the ghosts won't just tell them that there might be a spectre down below. The ghosts will actually give them a boon. So the ghosts, now remember, these are the Grand Masters of the Knights of the Golden Ages. So maybe, and this is just me suggesting for your game, maybe if the players persuade these knights that they're here to help, that they're here to put their fellow knights to rest in the crypt down below and clear out these monsters that have been disturbing them. Maybe these Grand Masters bestow a boon on the party, and maybe it's the boon of the Golden Ages, right? And as long as the party are in the dungeon, if for the next, say, 24 hours, they all get maybe +1 to AC, or maybe one of them can cast Shield of Faith, for free, effectively, as long as they're within the dungeon. And I think in this case, because we're talking about, these knights that are resting in this tomb, I think we want to make it clear that, their power only works within the dungeon. I think that's cool because it both means the party can't take the power with them when they leave, but it also thematically feels appropriate. Of course, their power doesn't extend beyond the borders of this dungeon. This is all they've known for as long as they've been dead. So I think that's the last thing I would say. Think about putting in your dungeon. Not necessarily everyone in your dungeon just wants to kill the party. Some of them just want to talk. Some of them just want someone to chat to, or they want to negotiate with you, or they want something, or they want something of their own, and they're happy to talk to get it. And this could be the prisoner we mentioned before. It could be these ghosts. It could be another race of monsters. Maybe it's kobolds. Maybe they have a feud with these goblins. It's very much up to you. And I would say, color it from the world you have around this dungeon, and think about who lives there and what they want, and how or why they might go into the dungeon. Now, I know I said that was going to be my final point, but there's another one I was going to throw in, which is have something weird in your dungeon. I don't know exactly how to explain this. One of the times I built a dungeon, the party never used this, but I had a room that was like, this was another old abandoned keep. It wasn't buried underground, I know, weird, but it was an old building, and the idea, and so this was this like keep that used to belong to an old kingdom that's long gone. And one of the rooms in this dungeon was a storage room. The party never went into this room. It had a small amount of treasure in it, a lot of stuff that nobody needed, a lot of like crap basically that had been stored and wasn't needed. But it had one magic item in it. It had a chair, and whenever you sat in the chair, your character, some random physical aspect of your character changed. So my initial plan for this was that it would swap your gender, and I mostly added that as a callback to there's a coffin that does that in Dark Souls 2, I believe. And I was thinking about how, something like that is kind of silly, and obviously if the party member in question is uncomfortable, they can just sit back in the chair and they're gone. They're fine. They've swapped back. Because you don't want to make anyone comfortable. That's not the point. The point is just that it's a bit of silliness. It's a bit of strangeness in the world that this chair does this, and it's like, well, why does the chair do this? Who made this? Something unusual. That's kind of, I think, fundamentally, and I guess this is the point I would make, something weird. I think a lot of the time it fundamentally has to be harmless. You don't want to hurt your party for being curious about the world, and you certainly don't want to punish them for touching the thing. That doesn't seem reasonable. But just having things in the world that are strange, that make them ask questions, is great. I think it's just a wonderful way to let them interact with the world and, I guess, reward their curiosity. I don't know if swapping someone's gender momentarily is a reward. I don't know. It's an experience anyway. It makes you think. But that idea of, the world has its own weird effects. I mean, if you're looking for other examples, how about, a shower, but when you walk into it, you become extremely dry, or it's a button, or like a brooch, but when you put it on your clothes, they all turn into a weird color. They'll turn bright yellow, for example. But yeah, something just weird, something weird in the dungeon, or like a funhouse mirror. Funhouse mirror is a really obvious example. Do something fun and magical with it, like there's someone who you can only see in the mirror, but they're in the room with you. So, geez, that sounds kind of scary. But not in a scary way, in a silly way. Like, they push you over in the mirror and then you can't see them in real life because they're invisible. Something like that. Something that's, you're not going after the party. You're just having a bit of fun together. I think that wraps up this sort of first, I don't know what this is. I don't know how this took this long. This was a podcast with just me because my boys, they've left me. I've got no boys. Help. If you've enjoyed this, I'm going to assume that you're a fan of our show, and thank you for listening and putting up with this strangeness. And we're sorry that we're sort of all about, at the moment, and we're not producing our regular stuff. We're going to go back to it, don't worry. We want to keep making Creature Club. We want to keep making all the shows you guys like, because it's really fun for us. We mentioned in the episode we recorded, but that's going to come out later, that we hit 100 subscribers, which is really cool. I know that in the age of the internet, it seems like 100 maybe isn't a lot, but it feels like a lot to us. It's really great to know that basically this is helping people, or even if it's not helping you run a game, that it's fun for you, that you're having fun listening to it. If you haven't recommended this to your friends, please, for the love of God, do not recommend this episode. Recommend any other episode. This is basically like the equivalent of emergency rations of an episode. This is for all you guys and gals. This is for all you people. Let's not gender anybody. Let's not this is for everybody who likes listening to the episodes on Monday. Because I didn't want us to miss an episode, I just thought I'd record something on my own. And because I love to hear myself talk, it's gone too long. So yeah, so you can subscribe, I guess, but I don't think you should subscribe for this. I can't imagine anyone doing that. But share it with your friends. That'd be excellent. We have all the episodes, and we have comments from our incredible listeners all on our website, which is creatureclubpodcast.com. We also have an email. It's a creatureclubpodcast@gmail.com. If you have any homebrew monsters or even homebrew magic items, or even examples of homebrew from other sources that you've read that you've really enjoyed, send them on to us. We want to kind of collect enough homebrew and then do like a whole episode about them. That'd be really cool, but we're not there yet, and it's something to look forward to. Yeah, I think that's everything. It's weird. I'm not used to. I don't want to say stay cool. That's DC's thing. So I'm just going to say thank you very much for listening. I've been Dan, and I've talked for far too long, and I think it's time I go to bed. Good night.